Hello everyone and welcome to Of God in Mind. And we're here today to discuss the newly released census results. Some interesting things on there. Bit of a smaller group today. With me here we've got Reggie
Hello.
and Adam.
Good day, folks.
Alright, so yeah, census results are in. You should be able to see them. The two main things we'll be talking about today is the change here. Oh, of course a highlight wouldn't work. Religious affiliation, with no religion becoming the top single grouping of religious affiliation. And the other big thing being that the born overseas number has continued increasing, and for the first time, when you're grouping Asia together, it's bigger than the European nations. We've also got a pretty this is the official census website you're seeing at the moment, the boring one, and the fancy pretty one with the spheres I'll be going through every now and then is ABC's website. I'll put links below. So, no religion overtaking Catholics as the highest single denomination. So there's a couple of reasons for this or possible reasons that I think could be causing this. For one, this is a trend we've been seeing in a while. As you can see, it's not a massive increase to begin with. It's actually, that 4% is a pretty big increase, 4.3% in terms of single statistics. And no religion is rising as just throughout the West as a start. But I think there's a few other factors in this Australian one worth taking into account. For one, the massive amount of immigration. Let's see if I can get the figures up. For example, the immigrants from China, as you might know from a bit of your history. China, the communist state, sort of tried to eradicate religion, both in China and in Russia. And so it's at a pretty low percentage in China, and the few that aren't. And you still have a bit of Buddhism and stuff, but generally no religion is dominant in China. And Japan also is probably... Is it on our list here? Okay, Japan isn't actually on our list here. But I'd say we probably get a few immigrants from there as well, and that's also... I think it's the least religious country in the world, Japan.
I think there was like probably a Scandinavian country.
It could be. But I thought Japan's definitely up there, whatever the case.
I thought Japan was quite religious. Like they had a lot of temples, and I don't know much about Japanese religion, but yeah.
I don't really want to Google that. Yeah, they do. They got a lot of things. Shinto, Buddhism are fairly big. I thought especially, I think they're losing their religion pretty rapidly, especially after World War II and so forth. So their culture's been changed around a lot. I could be wrong. But
Well, checking this handy-dandy Wikipedia page, Importance of Religion by Country, in terms of the countries that rank it unimportant, Estonia, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Czech Republic, Japan. But this isn't a metric of who believes what. It's just ranking it as unimportant. Or importance, yes.
Fair enough.
Oh, there's a religion in Japan wiki which has a survey from 2006, which is over a decade ago. A survey of religion. What does it mean by religion? Is it of? Okay, but over 50% put down folk Shinto or not religious. Oh wow. Okay, sorry. Yeah, but Buddhism was like 34%, Shinto organizations 4%, Christianity 2.5%, and no answer. Oh, okay. Yeah, so I guess you are right. I thought I thought Japan was a lot more religious than I expected. Yeah. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, so I think probably a big factor in this growth here, or decline, is most of our growth, as we'll talk about in a bit later, is from immigration, and a lot of those immigrants are likely not religious anymore, especially since one, they're probably young, which is less likely to have religion. I think I closed the page that had that stat on it, and they're likely from these Asian countries, in which religion, like, you're less likely to be religious. But I don't think that's all of it. Definitely religiosity is declining in Australia. A lot of people who would have once considered themselves to be Catholic or Anglican or some other church sort of, I always forget what these things are called. Church division by birth, no
Denomination.
longer denomination. That's the one. I'm the only Christian on tonight, and I don't even know that word. But yeah, they're no longer identifying as that. And I think it's telling too that the top percents here are Catholic and Anglican, which are kind of denominations that you're born into, essentially, more than the Protestant denominations where you sort of, that's less of a factor. So I think a lot of the decline as well is just people who really had nothing to do with their religion before are just no longer putting that on their census as having any importance to them in either their history or in their modern, their current outlook.
Yeah, Adam and I, we had a conversation about this once, like when we were younger. Like you were telling me a story about in Scouts how you had to put down your religion on some survey, and you just kind of put down. What did you put down, Adam?
So yeah, I put down Catholic because I was baptized Catholic. But yeah, so because I was in this, I guess backing up a bit, I was in the scouting movement when I was younger, and I went through Joey's Cubs, Scouts and Venturers. So essentially until from probably a decade until I was 17 or so. But you have like a little scout book, scout guide, I suppose, which kind of lays out, has the scout lore and the scout motto in it, and you can track your progress towards badges and etc. inside it. But on the front page, there's a section for ID, and it's like name, address, phone number, date of birth, all the things you typically expect on an ID. But then there was religion, which I found strange, I guess, as a child. And because I'd never, like, my parents never made a big deal out of religion. They essentially didn't bring it up at all. They answered our questions if we had any, but other than having us all baptized, that was it. And so I felt like I was being there was the expectation to label myself as something when I previously didn't have a label for myself.
Yeah, it's like the same with me. I just kind of grew up identifying as Buddhist because my parents told me I was Buddhist. But then it came around to like the census, or when I went to register for, I went to Canberra Hospital and they asked all the questions and like what religion, and I'm like, man, I've always been told I'm Buddhist, but like I don't know if I really believe. And like even for something like if I'm in an accident, they're obviously going to look at my religion, and that is going to influence what happens to me. And I was like, oh, I've always just kind of been told I'm Buddhist, and I've always kind of put down Buddhist, but like now that I reflect on it, I don't think I am. And that's kind of when you start shifting onto it and identifying, well, I started identifying as non-religious. But it was just, yeah, weird. It was like a label that you were kind of given and you didn't really think about when you were younger.
Yeah, I sort of had the same with Anglican. For ages it was Anglican. It never actually came up for me though, really. And by the time I was teenage years, I'd sort of shed that and become like non-religious. But now later in life, I've come back, and now I'm Baptist, but we don't make the list, unfortunately. But yeah, that sort of cultural element that you're born with that, and a lot of people don't think to change it or see any reason, and it's almost like a cultural sort of social division. We are this people from this region, and this is what we believe, even if it plays no part in their life. Like recently, I was looking at the Pew Research Center has done a bunch of studies showing stats from Eastern Europe and looking at things such as the religion in the countries and the place it actually plays in it. And you see really big numbers for people who identify as um, Orthodox, as part of the Orthodox Church and stuff like that. Yet you see very small numbers for people who actually say that plays a big part in their life or that regularly attend services and stuff like that. And it's much the same here in Australia with, like, we have this individual breakdown here. We've only got the top few religions shown, unfortunately, but once you're including all the Christian sort of denominations together, you'd still have a very large number there identifying as some form of Christian. Yet you look at numbers for church attendance and religion being important in their life and stuff like that, and it's very small. It's normally sub 10%, often sub 5% in that sort of breakdown. So a lot of this is just that sort of, I guess, sort of a cultural shift almost, in that did they have a religion by age? I don't think they did. We sort of
That
get
would
that
be
from
an
the
interesting
54
breakdown.
things. But yeah, generally the older generation are more likely to identify as a religion than the younger, because that's sort of how it was back in the day, and these days
I think
that's,
also back in the day, it was better to believe in a religion than to be non-religious.
yeah. And your churches were your big social hubs and stuff like that as well. Whereas that's a lot less the case now. Sort of no religion and doing nothing on Sundays is taken over. Like, other fun stats I found the other day is that, like, it's a very small amount of people who go to church on Sunday, but we're still beating people who attend sporting events. And actually, no, people who attend sporting events slightly beats us, and people who are part of a sporting club is less than Christians. They're all pretty around that same level, but that's not what I would have expected when your statistic is, if you're being generous, like 6% of people are in church on a Sunday, 6% of the population. It's just funny given how much Australia identifies as a sporting nation.
I dance on my Sundays.
Guess you're part of that percent, however much it was.
But the percent that does sporting, wait, so that fraction was just like sporting in general?
Or maybe it's not. Like, it was who do a sporting club. I would have thought that being part of a dance, I guess it's more of a class than
Oh
a
yeah,
club.
probably is. I don't know.
I don't know.
Some
It was
people
just
just
John
lazy and
Dixon
want to have their
posted these
Sundays.
numbers from some stats site. I never looked into it too much. Just thought, that's a fun thing.
Yeah.
Right, back onto the next big change. Ooh, is this the bit with the generation gap? I'm just scrolling down the ABC thing. We see that the baby boomers own all the homes, and apparently like 1%
Because
of
of those
kids own
damn
homes.
millennials and their avocado toast, Jesse.
I know.
Hashtag Ozpol.
What are we, Gen Y? Looks like we're
We are,
kind of
yes.
beating Gen
No, we're
X.
millennials.
Well, Gen Y and millennials are interchangeable.
Okay,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
It'd be kind
I
of
think
Generation
millennials
X
is more of
kind
a...
of funny,
after us or
kind of
Millennials
before
are...
us?
sad if we were millennials, because we're not even on the list unless we are that 1% who are kids.
Yeah, well, I mean, millennials is sort of more of a catch-all term than Gen Y. I mean, I think you're still Gen Y, you know, maybe up to 30 or a little bit above 30, but like you wouldn't call a 15-year-old Gen Y, but you'd probably call them a millennial.
Yeah.
Probably just the term we have until for the next decade or two until another word arises.
Yeah.
There's always going to be overlap.
No, people are born in like clearly defined blocks because that's when the Cabbage Patch sprouted its children. This is what I've been
Of
taught.
course. And we can just look at the calendar to see when the next harvest season is.
Alright, here we are, the immigration stats. So, immigration has increased. The born overseas has gone up 2.3%, which is probably important given that that's about 1 million people and we've grown by just about 2 million people. So with the lowering birth rate, apart from under Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, this doesn't have that stat here. I probably should have stuck with that other article. The ABS is not great at their media releases. They need to take some things out of ABC's or Pew research groups.
Well, I assume there'll be a big data dump at some point, or you can access it on their servers.
Yeah.
Because some plots would be nice.
But anyway, instead of complaining about
Instead,
ABS,
that's kind of left as an
website more.
exercise for the reader.
Like Australia is growing mostly through immigration, and of that immigration, well, England is still at the top. It's gone down a little bit, gone down 0.3%, which is kind of funny when you think of, like, I guess they must go to cities or something, because I've known, I think, one English person my whole life, despite them apparently being 4% of our population. Actually, I suppose I've
We
known
know,
two.
what, at least 2 here, Reggie?
Yeah, and more people at work. So just,
But we are,
to be
I
fair,
mean, we're in an
our work is
academic
particularly,
environment, so
yeah, it's not representative.
yeah, in an academic environment in Australia's capital city, so
I've been told that like most people that overstay their visas are actually just like people visiting from the UK that just overstay their 6 months that they're allowed in, and yeah, people attribute to those dirty foreigners, but it's usually just like UK citizens that have just come over to Australia and they get to stay here for 6 months and they just overstay the 6 months.
Yeah, I've seen the same thing. The majority of the illegal
Yeah.
immigrants we're always complaining about are actually just British tourists who didn't go home at the end
Yeah.
of their time.
Yeah.
But yeah, we do see the big switch here is that other than being from mostly, actually the stats here for the top 5 still show, oh, you've got Italy in the top list. That's where the switch came from. I suppose the other side was being a bit sensationalist with its breakdown of it, but we do definitely see bigger numbers here from Asia. China's grown up by 0.7%, 0.5% for India, and Philippines now makes the top list in place of Italy in terms of country of birth for immigrants. So overall Asia, and in the overall Asia has increased as the majority continent as opposed to Europe, which is what it was. And these numbers are likely to increase as that goes. So Australia's culture is slowly shifting. We are a country of largely immigrants, and from things I've read, a trend this day is for immigrants to seek to maintain their culture more than previously. Like previously in the earlier parts of the century, the trend was, or even just in the 50s, you come to the country, you adapt to its culture, you take on its ways and just become one of them. And this was specifically, I got a lot of this from reading an article about Muslim immigrants in Germany over the years. A journalist did a big study on them. But these days, people keep their culture and sort of attach it to the multicultural milieu of the nation.
Sorry, I just have a pet peeve. He said Australia is largely made of immigrants, and like I always go back to the whole, the original Australians were indigenous, and we're basically the majority are immigrants. But that's a different argument completely.
It's true. And we can
You get the
talk about
same
that
thing in
for a
the
bit.
US as well when people claim that we need to take the US back to its Christian roots. But the roots go further back than that. But that's another different topic. We'll go back to this Reggie's tangent and we can discuss that.
I mean, I was actually just copying whatever the census was saying, or
Well, do you think
whatever it. But
like people? I mean, it's not like I don't know. My anecdotal experience isn't that people are resistant to be- integrating themselves into the society. They just want to also not completely get rid of or forget their roots.
yeah,
Or are people seeing it the opposite way?
I think people see it the opposite way, but at the same time, like I think the reality is that, like, I mean, I wasn't around in the 50s and so forth. I don't really know what it was, but we sort of touched on some things earlier. It was very focused around a sort of a community based on these sort of central social organizations that you all went to, whether it was like the Sunday club or the church gathering or whatever, and everyone had these same traditions, and they'd all go do. Maybe this is a bit idyllic, but they'd all go this, and everyone had the same culture. If you're an immigrant, you adapted to that culture.
Yeah.
Whereas these days, populations are a lot larger. Those gatherings and that sort of community focus is less important, and people tend to maintain their own culture and tradition, and like they take on some Australian culture and tradition, and they keep their own, and you sort of have this mishmash now rather than everyone following this uniform culture, which personally I think is probably the better approach. Though there's
I
definitely
think
arguments to be
diversity is
made.
always better.
Yeah, you can make an argument for uniformity, but you're missing out on a lot when you go with uniformity.
Mm.
Maybe more stable, people may have an easier time understanding each other, but you're all looking at the same problems the same way, bringing the same perspectives to the table. You miss out on a lot that you gain through diversity.
But I mean, these arguments are probably more brought up along racial lines or ethnic lines, I suppose. Whereas if you're talking about people keeping parts of their culture, um, there are, say, German clubs or Polish clubs, and just the same as there are mosques or uh, other groups. It's not necessarily, it's everyone wants to keep bits of their culture.
Yeah, I think the big difference there is your sort of more related culture groups, like an Englishman and a German. They have different cultures, probably even different languages and so forth, but they've also got a lot in common. They've got the same sort of cultural roots in Indo-European and like actually German. That's where England came from back in the day. Languages are more similar. You'll often have a lot of similar traditions because of Christian influence on the cultures, and before that, Roman influence on cultures. So that affected Germans less, and just the general cultural spread that's happened over time. But an Englishman and someone from the Middle East or the Far East, you don't have that sort of. You're getting less of that commonality. You sort of only really have the. There's not been a whole lot of cultural interaction in the case of the Middle East, positive cultural integration, um, and in the Far East, I guess that's the same. I mean, Englishmen kind of bombarded them to sell them opium. But anyway, getting off track. Basically, the point is that shared history and that shared culture gets more and more distant depending on your culture group. So we tend to break down these cultures along nice and easy to differentiate racial lines of um, Asians and Arabs and Africans and indigenous, which often like the country will just use the same term depending on what whoever their indigenous people are and the various nations that make up those people.
I mean, I guess such classifications are important, but ultimately they greatly generalize or simplify things, because in the same way that, British culture is different from German culture, and you might just say that's Western or European or white culture, there's many different, say, African nations or cultural groups, or those from different parts of Asia.
Yeah, and like to some degree it's necessary. Like I like history a lot and studying culture, spread of ideas around the world, that sort of thing. But even studying that quite a lot, I know a fair bit about European culture. I know probably sort of a medium amount about, I guess, almost the northern Asian cultures like China, Japan, Korea. Not a whole lot about the Southeast. Only a very small amount about Australian Indigenous cultures. I probably almost know more about American Indigenous cultures. And I know nothing of Africa, barring like the Northern Shore stuff, the North African stuff, which is quite different to anything sub-Saharan. For like just your average person, they've got no idea of the sort of subtle differences and the history that's formed those differences between these cultures. It would just be nice, I suppose, if people recognized that a bit more and didn't think these people were all literally the same.
I don't know what you're talking about, Jesse. Obviously, there is just one kind of Chinese person and one kind of Arabic person. Arabic person, I should
Arabic?
say.
I mean, they all look the same so clearly.
Yeah, because white people don't look the same, do they?
I've
Have
been
you
finding that
looked
more
in
and
like?
more as I like if you watch a bunch of movies, like especially if all the white people in it are of similar age and hair color, if I'm not paying a massive amount of attention to the movie or I'm not super invested, I've got no idea who these characters are. It's like, oh, is that old guy I saw before or is that a new old guy?
The the
Like,
I think one of the best examples of this, and sadly, uh, it's also a unfortunate example, is say look at, I don't know, like the U.S. House of Representatives or something. It's like, how many old white men can you count?
Did I count that one already?
Is that the same one but in a different suit? Who knows? I think I'm picking on the US.
Well, like one of the first visualizations that the ABC one has is like question of male to female in parliament and CEOs. But we were talking about immigration, which is funny, like because Australia has one of the toughest like immigration policies. It's hard to get into the country and it's hard to land a job here. Like the way that it was described to me how my partner got the job here is that his boss basically had to tell the government why he wasn't giving the job to an Australian, and it was because no one that applied for the jobs that was Australian had the skills for it. So it's like it's pretty tough to like just get your foot in the door to like get into Australia in the first place. And it's surprising that of yeah most of the increase in population is due to immigration. I don't know what that says about the population and skill set or other things, but that was surprising to me.
yeah, it is interesting that. I think part of it you could probably put down to sheer numbers. Like as Asia is now sort of reaching, or like as China and Japan are now reaching parity or even surpassing Western nations in terms of education and stuff like that, the high skilled jobs, just by sheer number, you'd get more suitable candidates from those nations than you would from a tiny nation such as Australia with our 20 million people, or 23 million now.
24, I think, as of the census.
It's got 23,400.
Is it? Okay.
Census was a year ago, but we probably haven't gained the next million yet. It's actually a pretty high population growth comparatively. I think a lot of other nations
The
are
population
not
growth is
having that
going
much.
down, though.
That's increasing. It's got a 8.8%, but if you took out immigration, you probably would see a decrease. Whereas a lot of other, I mean, this is just going off something I may have read a while ago, but I thought a lot of other places you have very low population growth, like European countries and so forth, because immigration is
Well,
less and childbirth is less. So you're sitting
this
around
is
like
this
a
is one of the things
3,
about
4%.
you're taught this in like high school, like demographics. You have the population pyramid, and if you have a population pyramid, then you have like unsustainable population growth. So you want to have like a population column because that is more sustainable, and it tended to be countries like China and India, which had like a population pyramid where they had booming populations and that was unsustainable. But more developed countries had, population column where the birth rate was similar to the population growth rate and also the death rate. So it kind of balanced it out. Did you ever learn that in high school geography?
I don't remember it.
Don't think I.
Hmm. I remember explicitly being taught this. Hold on. But continue talking.
I'm looking at our, am I in the right tab? Yeah, the generation gap, according to the, do we actually have numbers here? No. Our median age has gone up by a year. But like, if we're looking at the ABC thing here, we've got kind of an odd population spread. The baby boomers, they look lower than Gen Y, which is, Gen Y has significantly more than Gen X, who seems to be less than baby boomers, which is what you'd expect. And then kids is a massive percentage. And silent generation is tiny because, of course, they're old enough to have high fatality rates these days. I suppose baby boomers are
Well,
hitting that reach too.
that's kind of another way of showing the population the demographic diagrams I just sent to you guys. So if you check that out. So I guess those numbers are kind of hinting at a mild pyramid, but not really. Like you're expecting to not have as many older people as you do younger people, but it's just the proportions of those can tell you about whether you have sustainable or unsustainable population growth in the country.
Yeah. And the idea
I mean, I
behind
guess
that,
it's.
like from
Sorry,
what I've heard,
go on,
is
Jesse.
the younger population is sort of the working age. They're the ones who do the work and help support the other people as they get older and become less able to work and do things for themselves. So if you don't have enough young people for the old people, and you're running like, and you have social security measures and so forth, healthcare and everything, that's going to massively inflate in terms of cost. And so higher taxes and so forth for a not working population. And if you don't have very good, like if your country is not doing amazingly to begin with, you'll start getting a crash at that point.
Yeah, so
I'd
if
have
you're
to
like, if
wonder
not
how
enough,
much. Go on. I was changing topic
I
a
was going
little
to
bit.
say, yeah, I guess that's one argument for, well, not having enough younger people coming in, then they talk about the median age. So that's also increasing. So you have to care more about providing for your older population. But if you just, I guess, if you have one of those booming populations and you just naturally have enough younger people that you can look after the older people, and you don't have to think about that consciously and have legislation. Because like the aging population is always something that's brought up a lot in politics here, having to care for the aging population.
You can see there's a lot of social factors that go into these pyramid diagrams. So, like I think as Reggie said, you've got it's essentially a plot, and on one side of it you've got males, on one side you've got females, and then on the vertical axis are a series
There's
of
bins
bars
of age.
corresponding to age bins. So at the very bottom you've got the youngest age group, and at the very top you've got the oldest age group. But in terms of, I guess, as a country gets more industrialized slash develops more advanced technology and becomes more stable, you'll get a bunch of things happening. So like life expectancy will increase due to like general cleanliness, hygiene, medicine, and I guess if the nature of work is not so much physical, like we're not all out being farmers anymore, that changes the people who can work. And even things like birth control and getting women into the workforce, I think, would play a factor into that diagram.
Yeah, that's the point I was about going to raise earlier. Like the sort of healthy pyramid of much more young people than old was true for the majority of history, but modern industrialization and computer technology and stuff like that is sort of like a lot of that is changed. It's not important to be in your 20s and fit anymore to do work. Like a lot of our jobs are no longer even physical. They're just doing stuff on a computer so that the computer will make the right thing happen for you, and that's only going to increase. So having massively younger population is probably less important now than it used to be. Though you still have factors like healthcare will still increase as you get older. Our bodies are better at living longer, but that doesn't mean that they stay healthier longer. You start getting more issues and need more spent on healthcare and such like stuff like that. And so you get too lopsided and it's still gonna mess things up a bit.
Because
But
historically, didn't like before, even at the beginning of like the 20th century, wasn't there a huge chance that a child would die before age like 5 or age 10? And I guess to counteract that, there needed to be a really high birth rate in
yeah,
order to just break even.
that's the reason families of so many kids were so common. Like you'd have about 12 kids and you might even only get 4 out of those that live.
Mm.
To
And
adulthood.
yeah, to adulthood, and then in adulthood itself you've got still got a whole bunch of risks: war, disease, just outright not being able to have enough food and so forth. Like that's why if you're measuring ages from, like, if you've ever seen stats of ages that are averaged from other times in history, they'll often be really tiny. It'll be like, okay, the average age was about 18. People generally only live to 30. That's because you don't use stats like that. You use generally median is the easiest one to use because you sort of clip off some
That's
of those
probably why you
outlying
get.
children and then people live generally not quite as long as you can see from this little graph here. In West Africa, you still have less people at the high ends, but it's not as if people in history couldn't make it to 80. Some did. It's just a lot more didn't, so your average is way skewed. Like we've only probably added like 20 years average age to people, but it was all the age, the general sort of makeup and so forth of society and the ages is not terribly different to what we'd know.
And I mean, in terms of just typical expectation of, someone going into adulthood is quite different now compared to what it was 100 years ago. Which brings into it questions and discussions about like the changing nature of what work is and getting into the housing markets and starting a family and marriage. And there's a reason that the census is important. It's like there's so many interconnected things here. It'd be impossible to do without numbers.
I just sent you guys like another population pyramid, but it was for Australia in 2014. And you see like there is this big growth, but then around like the 30 mark, it actually starts to turn again. And I'm wondering whether that's because of how in the olden days you would just try to have as many children as you can to get more of them through adulthood, where that's kind of like a bounce back because people were still kind of doing that, but the medicine was better, so more of them were surviving, and then the birth rate was decreasing. Because, I mean, it's hard to tell with these, but I was wondering whether that was why you have like this surge in this like the middle age population.
Yes, for the audio only listeners, yeah, the plot Reggie's talking about isn't so much a pyramid as it's a pyramid until about the age of what, 50 perhaps. Then it kind of starts to taper in, and then it just drops sharply when you get, say, the 15 to 19 age bracket. So I mean, looking at this, it seems to be like Gen X and and the baby boomers are overrepresented, or put another way, perhaps millennials and Gen Y aren't as well represented.
Part of that reason is history. Like the reason we call the baby boomers is because that's at a point when they were very, like we just ended the war. We'd lost, I'm not sure quite how many people Australia lost in the war, but either way, we had a war, lost a lot of people, and so people were encouraged, okay, there's lots of empty jobs and houses and everything. We need to get our population back booming again. So let's have lots of babies. We'll give you big bonuses. The government will help you in this. And so you have the baby boomer generation is born out of that. They're sort of the children of that effort. And I think also immigration was probably lax and less. Immigration laws were probably laxed at the time. So Australia's had a bit of a complicated set of immigration laws where they'll alternate from being incredibly harsh to relatively loose, depending on how the country's doing. So like when we undertook the Snowy River Dam construction project and everything, all of a sudden we're like, okay, let's bring in a whole bunch of people from countries we previously didn't allow to be constructed and so forth. So you have a whole bunch of immigrants coming at the same time. Sort of similar to how America did with their railroad. I think that's when a lot of Asian workers came in during building the railroads.
Jesse, do you know much about the rhetoric surrounding, say, asylum seekers or refugees, say, during or after any of the wars of the past century? I mean, we've spoken on the show before about like Australia's immigration policy and specifically for like refugees and asylum seekers. Do you know what it was like during or around the war? Wars, plural.
Unfortunately not. Like we did get an influx. Like Jacob's grandparents came to Australia at that point, fleeing Mussolini in Italy. So sort of pre-war you get a bit of immigration, but post-war I don't know. I think generally post-war is just such a sort of depression for a country in terms of um, just having lost so many people, so many fit working age men, so much industry and material and so forth, that generally people are sort of like, well, this all sucks. Let's pull together and make it all work. And you'll allow immigrants from other places and so forth, sometimes even your enemies, surprisingly enough. Like, it didn't take too long for Germans and Japanese to be immigrating again. The World War II is kind of a weird war in how quickly everyone bounced back in terms of sort of racial divides it causes. Others had much longer lasting enmity, probably because there was a lot more political than nation based compared to others. But yeah, I don't know anything too particular about immigration policies or attitudes to it surrounding war. Though I think there is still a bit of it, like, especially among people who have lived through a war, if they've lost people, they're often rather bitter towards, say, Germans or Italians. Like, there's still discrimination against, like, talking to German and Italian ancestry people I know, they still face discrimination sometimes from older people for being that nationality. So it's not a popular move with anyone. But I think in general, countries just kind of want to rebound from that massive crash that they've had during the war, that the immigration laws themselves will be a bit laxer.
So was it Blaine Hanson that said that we were being swamped by Muslims?
After she said we're being swamped by Asians, yes.
Yeah, I mean, has she seen the census? Because like, other is still a lot smaller than Catholic, Anglican, Uniting Church combined. And I
But you see, Reggie, those people we can think of as white people. And
It would be kind of funny to
oh,
see what
because
she
to her,
actually
like
wrote about
Muslims are
this.
race.
Yeah, she sees Muslims as a violent threat, a sort of enemy in a war. But she also kind of is a populist who'll play to whatever. She used to be super against Asians and so
well,
forth.
I mean, she coming from like the 90s when she first had her platform and first rose to prominence versus now, I mean, she just the rhetoric became about like Islamic terror and Muslims, and so she changed her platform. As Jesse said, populism.
Yeah.
But there's, like, you can sort of understand where her and her followers come from to a degree, because as we talked about earlier, um, like, this is a large percentage of immigrants. This is a large percentage of immigrants who have a radically different culture to the European we're used to. Um, and for some people, people who like that sort of uniform culture, that being able to easily tell what their neighbors are thinking and doing, you sort of you have a backlash at that. And when you couple that with an economic depression, which is sort of happening, not that the West is in a depression, but our skyrocketing growth is slowing as equality spreads around the world, is the real root cause of that. We aren't able to just abuse other countries as we used to. They are now also rich and powerful. But anyway, you couple that with that and this changing demographic, this new growth, these others coming into our country without sharing our culture and our ideals, they become a threat as your own sort of life is in decline, and the sort of familiar faces you're used to are replaced by ones you don't know, don't understand as well. People start going a bit into threat mode, and you get the massive rise in right-wing populism we see around the place. Which is sad, really, that we are so quick to get all clannish just because we're not making as much money anymore, when the real cause is often the people who are making lots of money.
Yes, which I think we could have an entirely different discussion about.
Yeah.
It'll probably be interesting at some point. But yeah, I mean, it's also a matter of just, as Jesse said, it's further removed, I guess, from what we think of as Western culture. So you, it's you don't immediately have some sort of connection with it, and you may not even know anyone well. Like, I mean, I know growing up where I did, it wasn't the most. I didn't know the most diverse crowd of people in terms of either race or religion. And so, in such an environment, I guess it's easy to believe that these people that you have never met, are stereotypes or what commentators talk about.
I guess it depends on where you grow up, because the anecdotes vary obviously, but the statistics are not aligning with the anecdotal evidence as you should expect. Like in the Age article, they mentioned that Buddhists are now most likely to come from Vietnam, 26%, while Muslims are now likely to hail from Pakistan, 14%, Afghanistan, 11%. But none of those countries are where Australia gets most of its migrants. So even then, like, the statistics are still saying it's a tiny population of the immigrants. So just like Hanson's claim of we're being swamped is like completely, debunked by all the statistics. But I guess it could be just her anecdotes of where she is and where the immigrants tend to be moving to. But yeah, you got to try to separate anecdotes and statistics.
Yeah, like our little example earlier of the majority of illegal immigrants actually just being British tourists who never went home.
Yeah,
But
got to
part of
find
that is
statistics on
also,
that.
yeah, part of that is also the like with Muslims, in at least you have that sort of outsized presence because you have your particular terrorist groups very much making their presence felt, um, doing the random acts of violence all around the world to get attention and to show themselves as that. So people start, for one, that's about all the news shows. Anytime there's anything
Yeah,
that could be a terrorism attack anywhere in the world, it's all over the news. Whereas equal,
like, do we
even
Yeah,
have all
greater
the
not to
Rise
attacks.
Up
mention,
Australia rallies being shown? Like,
but I mean,
do all
not
the
to mention
Australians know
social
about?
media as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So media presence is part of the thing for thinking there's a lot more Muslims than there actually are, and thinking those Muslims are a particular way when they aren't. But media portrayal is a whole different thing. So there's a degree of that. You can see similar example outside of that in like homosexuality, gay rights movements. Like, it's kind of surprising how tiny the percentage actually is of people in homosexual relationships and who identify that way, given the actual like the presence of the movement everywhere. Like, we got the numbers, or the last number had. Um, I really should have kept the Age article open. It did have more numbers than this,
oh yeah, the last
but it was
number.
a very small amount. It was like
It,
40,000 couples or something, which is about,
yeah,
Yeah,
so like
so
yeah,
47,000
47,000.
same-sex couples in Australia after the number of people declaring themselves in same-sex relationships surged by 42% since
It's still
2011.
yeah, so
less
that's,
But
than a percent. It's still
so
so
yeah,
tiny.
since 2006, when the number of same-sex couples numbered 26,000, there has been an 81% rise. I mean, alongside this, of course, there are discussions about uh, widespread public acceptance of like LGBT plus folk, um, which, yeah, I guess depending on who you are, you might not be out, or might not be, uh, you might be questioning, or etc.
yeah, there's a lot of factors around that. I mean, there's probably factors around that for Muslims too, come to think of it, given public perception at the moment.
Mm.
Depending on how strong you are in your faith, you may choose not to identify as Muslim just because you're afraid, especially if you've come from a nation where the government is likely to do things against minorities and so forth.
That's so sad.
But the general point there was just that perception and reality are different in a lot of cases. All right. That's probably about all. The only other big thing in the census was really that the only growing percentage of, like, not accounting for immigration, actually, it might even have been the only growing sort of grouping of Australians was Indigenous. They're the only ones with a high birth rate, enough to overcome fatalities.
Is it to overcome fatalities, or is it a lack of like proper education concerning, sex
my point was
and
the birth
contraceptives
rate
and stuff?
itself.
Yeah.
Like, if your birth rate's positive, you're overcoming your fatalities, whereas if it's not.
Oh yeah. Okay, that's fair. That's a different argument to other things.
Yeah. Like, the reasons for that, there's many. I don't feel particularly qualified to talk about any, having not looked into it terribly much. But they're growing.
And yeah, nor have I, and with our current panel composition, I wouldn't feel comfortable discussing it.
Yeah. But they are 3.2% or something now. Actually, there was numbers for that. Which is kind of cool. Yeah, 600,000 people. 650,000 people. Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. This is also part of the like we sort of mentioned ethnic grouping and outlooks sort of before, and this is part of the reason it's a bit difficult when you are talking about indigenous populations, such as here in Australia or even in America, and something where a continent that previously had very few people on it, due to still living in hunter-gathering sort of lifestyle, which doesn't sustain very large populations. You have an industrialized invader come, and all of a sudden you have 600,000 Aboriginals who were native to the land compared to 22 million people who aren't. And so it sort of gets complicated there just in sheer number of people, in both thinking about the first inhabitants and how much of a role they play. But as we said, we probably won't get into that too much.
I mean, I'll just add that the population of Indigenous Australians at the time of permanent European settlement is contentious and has been estimated at between 318,000 and 1 million. So at the highest value, the number of Aboriginal Australians, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, I should say, today still is not at that high value. But as it said, it's contentious, with me pulling this from Wikipedia, which pulls it from a paper, I think, from Miles Goff, following the citations. But as Jesse said, I'm not at all familiar with the issue.
All right. Well, that has been a podcast. Thank you all for joining us. See you all next time.
Will do. Good night.
See ya.